Hi everyone, welcome back to our journal club. We are just waiting for Dr. Jessica Fife, whose Facebook name is Jess F. Binate, I think is how you pronounce it. So I'm just waiting for her to join the video. Tonight we're going to be talking about firearms, which should be an interesting topic. I work at the VA, as does Jessica, though she does telehealth. So I'm talking about and asking about firearms all day long, and I've never thought I would actually learn so much about guns as a psychiatrist. And so while we're waiting for her, I just want to let you know our website is up and running. It's psychiatrynetwork.com. So exciting. And I have started adding blog posts to it. I have some blog posts in queue that are, I'm trying to kind of space them out, posting each week, but we are still taking submissions. I have a great team of 3 of our group members who are helping to edit all the posts. And so if you are interested in writing about various topics, feel free. Tonight, if you go on the website and look under the blog, you can see a post by Dr. Eric Messamore, who is our schizophrenia expert or psychosis expert. And it's interesting because he actually put a post up about psychotherapy, which I was surprised he wanted to write about, but it's very, very useful. I actually really liked it. So take a look and see his post and keep an eye out. So let me just check on Jessica. If she's able to join us, because I think she might be having some trouble. Oh, okay, she said she's not. So let me see if I can, okay, let me see if she's watching the video. And let me see what I can do to get her added. Oh, there she is. Okay, that was fast. Trouble. Hi, Giotsna. How are you? And hi, Laura. Hi, Jessica. How are you?
Hi.
Perfect
Hey, guys.
timing.
Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
I can
great.
hear you. Yeah, I think the
Okay,
audio
great.
is good. And
Okay, good.
I haven't had a chance to read your bio. I'm just pulling it up right now.
Okay.
Oh no, I think one moment. Okay. Sorry, guys. So Jessica's joining us from Alabama, by the way, right?
Yes, that is correct.
Yeah. So in Illinois, the gun laws are pretty strict. I don't know how they are in Alabama.
No,
How are they? Not strict.
they're
That's what I was
not.
thinking
No.
because, well, we're next
Yeah.
door to Indiana, and Indiana has very lax gun laws, and so
Yeah.
we always kind of have to be aware of that when we're asking patients about guns. I was telling everybody that you work for the VA, which I learned,
Yes.
and that we're talking about guns all day long, uh,
Yes.
which is okay.
Yes. And gun
I did,
locks and all
yeah,
kinds of things.
exactly.
Yeah.
All right. So I do have your bio up, so I'm going to just read
Okay.
that. Dr. Jessica Fife is a psychiatrist practicing in Alabama. She attended the University of Alabama School of Medicine and completed psychiatry residency at University of Alabama Birmingham's Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Neurology in 2010. Her current clinical work includes working with local community mental health as the medical director of Montgomery Area Mental Health, and is also the
Mm-hmm.
ACT team and outpatient commitment team doctor. She also works for the VA healthcare system through telehealth from her home office, seeing patients in Texas and New Mexico. Dr. Fife chose psychiatry as a field of practice after leaving emergency medicine residency, which turns out to be one of her best life decisions. She enjoys Psychiatry Network for the case discussions and the camaraderie with peers. So yeah, I learned a lot about you from
Yay.
that.
Yay.
How long were
Yeah.
you in emergency medicine residency
Just a
before
year
you
and a
left?
half, a year
Okay.
and a half. And I said,
Yeah.
this is it for me.
Yeah. No,
I
that's,
had to move on and do something different.
yeah.
It was a major life decision for sure, but
Sure. Oh, yeah.
super glad
Of
I did
course.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Well,
Um,
good. We're glad to have you.
okay. All right, do you want me to get started or we want
Yeah,
to?
yeah.
Okay,
No,
awesome.
go ahead.
Okay,
Take it away.
so I'll start by saying thank you so much to Christina and to Rebecca Jones for organizing this. It's been really great. The second thing that I will say is that I've done a lot of the ABPN questions, so I'm going to try really to, there's a lot of information in this article. And I'm going to try to highlight what's important. So the title of the article is Prevention of Firearm Suicide in the United States, What Works and What is Possible. It's a review article published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2016. Time frame is roughly 1980 to 2015, and they chose 70 articles over that period of time. Essentially, their goal was to examine all the available evidence on relationships between firearm ownership rates and firearm suicide rates, with the goal of discussing, sort of as a secondary discussion, discussing the potential effectiveness of policy-based strategies for preventing firearm suicides, and then sort of also by extension all other types of gun violence. I will say one of the things to look at in this article when you're reading through it is they mention a lot the overall suicide rate and then the firearm suicide rate. So you sort of have to keep those straight because it's different sort of geographically, as we have mentioned. And so firearm suicide rate makes up a certain percentage of the overall suicide rate, depending on sort of where you are. They essentially, in these 70 articles, you've got sort of these three broad types that they pulled. This is not necessarily important, but I am going to review this really quick. So they've got the case-controlled studies. So basically what they're doing is they're taking, identifying groups of households that contain firearms versus those that don't contain firearms, and sort of examining different facets of the difference in suicide rates by firearm and just the suicide rates in general. So there's lots of those. Then the second sort of broad type is sort of an ecological study. So looking at regional variations in firearm ownership, both in the United States and then globally, and also firearm ownership and suicide rate relationships, both in the US and globally. And then also sort of they talk about trends in gun ownership over time in a couple of places, and we'll go over that. But then the third sort of broad category of these 70 articles is really the time series studies. These are pretty interesting. They looked at firearm ownership and firearm suicide rates both before and after different pieces of legislation were enacted. Again, US and globally. And so sort of in examining the findings, hi Rebecca, sort of in examining the findings of all of this, I mean, I think it's not surprising that there is a relationship. There's a relationship between firearm ownership and firearm suicide rates, and they're usually related. One of the biggest points that they make at the beginning of the study is that firearm ownership in the United States, like determining actual household ownership, is very difficult. So a lot of these are estimates. It's a lot easier in other countries where there are usually more across the board rules about permitting firearms and things like that. State to state, we have great variability on whether or not you have to have a license, permit to buy a weapon or not. In the past, they've done things sort of use like proxy measurements, even like in the 70s and 80s, they used like gun magazine subscriptions and hunting licenses, and then obviously crimes that involve firearms, and from that sort of start to extrapolate how many households in that region would contain a firearm. So it's not an exact science, I guess is my point. Just if you look temporally over the United States, from 1962 to 1975, there were the addition of about 6 million new firearms. So 1962 to 1975. So we've got, sort of Vietnam era stuff. And so you've got more, these are both imported and manufactured in the US firearms. The suicide rate also rose in conjunction at that time, the firearm suicide rate. Then in the 1980s, the trend sort of reversed. There was really about a 22 year period from 1981 to 2002 where household gun ownership dropped. This is an important part. So in that roughly 20 years, household ownership of gun ownership dropped from about 46% estimated nationwide to about 36%. So that's a 10% drop. There was a 4.2% decline in the firearm suicide rate during that period of time in adults. It's much more pronounced for children. So for the child and adolescent suicide rate, it actually dropped 8.3% over that same period of time. So the adult one dropped 4.2%, the kids 8.3. I think a conclusion from that, or not a conclusion, but you infer that sort of the kids are less likely to buy a new firearm. They're more likely to use what's currently available to them. Geographic variability obviously comes into play, and some of the findings that they sort of discuss that are also sort of important, hi Julie, is in 2000 to 2002, they compared the suicide rate. So they took all the states in the United States, then they grouped the 15 states that had the highest suicide by firearm ownership rates. It's about 47% of households in these 15 states had owned firearms. So it's 47%. If you take the lowest states, the lowest rate of firearm ownership in states, there's this bottom group down here that's about 15%. So that's sort of our variability. You've got 15% up to 47%. There is a twofold increase in the adult suicide rate by firearm between those two groups of states, if that makes any sense. This was 2000-2002 timeframe. There was another study that repeated essentially the same thing in 2008-2009. They had the same findings. So doubles the suicide rate when you basically have, when you move from a state that has a 15% household ownership rate to one of the higher ownership states that roughly is about 47%. So in reviewing the case-controlled studies, yeah, okay, so let me actually get the numbers for this one. Again, a lot of the same stuff about suicide rates and gun ownership, but there is a significant reduction in the rate of adolescent, oh here it is, child and adolescent firearm suicides if you do one of these four things. What they found is that if you, in a household that already has a gun, if you lock the gun in a closet, keeping guns unloaded, or locking and storing ammunition in a different part of the house, it reduces risk of a completed suicide by that child and adolescent by a range, depending on which paper you're looking at, 55 to 73%. So if you do those three, compared to a household that doesn't do those things. So locked gun closet, keeping guns unloaded, locking or storing ammunition in a different part of the house. They also looked at comparing household firearm ownership rates in households that have a person living there that has a psychiatric illness and households that don't have someone living there that has a psychiatric illness. And there's no difference in the rate of gun ownership. So I think, again, it's something that sort of we all kind of know. Just because you have somebody in the household with a psychiatric illness doesn't make you more likely to have a gun in the house. It's more likely affected by things like geography and where you live and things like that. Just a quick look at some of the legislation outside the United States, some of the biggest things that really people that look at how to legislate in the United States look at countries like Switzerland, Australia, and New Zealand that have had some significant reductions in firearm suicide deaths. Australia is kind of a good one to look at. Again, not like super important for what we're working with on a daily basis, but just as an example. In 1996 in Australia, they had a mass shooting. New laws enacted after that required that firearms be registered to their license owner. It prohibited private gun sales, which is a biggie. And required a justification of having a firearm beyond just sort of like self-defense. At the same time, police had conducted a large-scale gun buyback that removed about 1/5 of the country's guns from circulation. So in the 18 years preceding that 1996 gun reform, there were 13 mass shootings in Australia. In the years since 1996, that legislation, there have been no mass shootings in Australia. So after reviewing all of those things, they sort of then kind of turn to, okay, what methods are possible in the United States? Here comes some sort of important things. And to sort of lay the groundwork, one of the biggest, I think, I wouldn't call it an obstacle maybe, but just background info. In 2008, the District of Columbia versus Heller upheld an individual, here my dog's barking, sorry.
That's okay.
Individual's Second Amendment right to possess firearms. Essentially, this was sort of an academic endeavor by an attorney to collect several cases of incidents where individuals had defended themselves or defended their household with a firearm justly based on the law. So that forced a lot of gun control advocates to move from looking at national sort of federal legislation to back more towards like targeted, very specific targeted, sort of more narrow restrictions and to target those kind of legislation. So more things like you must at least have a permit, or something like that, and say that all the states have to require a permit to buy and focus on that part. 3 states, after several mass shootings in the United States, there were 3 states that did actually enact legislation allowing temporary seizure and restriction of firearms for people deemed at risk of harming themselves or others, irrespective of psychiatric illness. So just for dangerous behavior. So not just because they have a psychiatric illness, but because they have been, they have dangerous behavior or have some significant reason to think that they would harm themselves or others and have firearms in the home. They go on to also make the connection with the review of a few papers that most individuals with psychiatric illness are never violent towards others, and psychiatric diagnosis alone is a very poor predictor of future firearm violence. This is a really starred important thing. Most of the good policies that have gotten any traction focus on restricting firearm access based on the dangerous behaviors, just like what I said before, not on the psychiatric illness. Seem more effective, just the dangerous behavior restriction is more effective at reducing firearm violence. The other type of potential method to be used in the United States that gets some traction is in California in 2014, a targeted sort of regulation called the Gun Violence Restraining Order, or GVRO, Gun Violence Restraining Order. It sort of was enacted. It sort of models the process for domestic violence restraining orders that are available to people in 50 states. And it's basically a strategy for preventing the firearm violence. It's enacted by a family member, interested party, or the police. It can be temporary or permanent, the one in California. Um, it's, you know what, I'm sorry, let me restate that. It's a temporary or permanent restraining order that's issued technically by the court, but it's after either family or the police have petitioned the court. So again, similar to a physical restraining order for something like domestic violence. They have several little avenues to make it permanent, make it so that the person cannot actually acquire firearms in the future, etc. The one limitation that they have found from that is that family members are sort of the mainstay for initiating these. And family members are not always completely in tune with how at risk their family members are. And that's been a limitation. So they're also focusing on extending this benefit or extending the rule to say that other sort of gatekeeper type people like primary care physicians, I assume psychiatrists, other people, could also enact this kind of enact this sort of court order to restrict the firearms. Something super important also that they point out in sort of several places is that guns used for suicide are bought a mean of 11 years before the suicide. So I think people have this thought that they're kind of that's one of the things, sort of, if you're looking at the broad scope of the thought behind what legislation to enact, what's really going to be the best. It's restricting the access to the gun in the home, not necessarily at the point of sale. If they would like to do it at both places, but if you've got to pick one and go for it, it's more restricting access to the firearm in the home because, again, 11 years normally the firearm's been in the home
I
before it
didn't know
may
that.
be used for suicide. Yeah, that was, I didn't realize that either. So Indiana, yeah, that you mentioned, they also have a GVRO policy that's actually taken a step further than California. And basically it says that basically police, if they see anything dangerous involving a firearm, can actually seize the firearms at that time and then take it to court later. They don't have to go to court first to enact the petition to seize the firearms. If they see something that looks dangerous, they can seize the firearm then, and then file the paperwork in court later. So that's something that Indiana does. It's sort of an extra step. Oh, and then they also found both in Indiana and Connecticut that has a similar law. They reviewed all of the cases and found that the firearm seizure reports, let's see, okay, firearm seizure reports in general, the most common reason is suicide risk. It's not that they think they're going to go shoot somebody else. It's the most common reason is suicide risk. So going on, sort of trying to figure out what they could do in the United States based on, evidence from other countries and sort of what we know. The other big thing that they talk about is implementation of something called PTP laws. I've mentioned this a few times, but it's permit to purchase. So not all states, you have to have any sort of permit, license, anything to go purchase a firearm. And it's different rules, long guns, short guns, stuff like that. But you can go buy something with really no license, no nothing in several states. So Connecticut implemented PTP laws, so the permit to purchase, making people actually go buy a very low cost permit that's usually associated with some sort of literature on gun safety. Even there's one state that does a day class and stuff like that for gun safety. In Connecticut, when that was implemented, it was associated with a reduction by 15% in the firearm suicide rate alone. Conversely, Missouri's PTP law was repealed, and the firearm suicide rate went up by 16% in the following years. There's some talk, I'm not going to go over it too much, on the gun safety education. That's always sort of on the table, but I don't think, based on this article, that they feel really that it's very effective because there's not really a point. Just like I was saying, there's not a point at which you can sort of catch all these folks. If they're not required to A, get a license, or B, they talk to gun store owners and dealers about potentially giving education, and it's not going well, I think is what they're saying. The other thing that I thought was interesting is, smart gun technology. That's the other thing that gets a lot of traction. Seems like it would be a really cool thing. Like you kind of can, things like fingerprint recognition, or there's one firearm where like the hand grip basically is recognized, and that's individual. So you get people that are able to keep a firearm in their house, but only used by them. So in theory, that seemed like a good thing. However, in real life, in about 2015, a big manufacturer sort of marketed those things, and gun stores did not sell it. And the reason that ultimately they did not sell it, I had to look this up otherwise, because I was like, why not? Why would people not want to do that? Because of the technology, some of them have like a bracelet, like a little wrist bracelet that sort of has a Bluetooth thing connected to some of this other stuff. People feel like that there's more likelihood of government monitoring or government intervention on these things. There's also a cost thing. These are much more expensive. And so I think people feel like that if they implement this, that you have to have all of this smart gun technology on weapons. It also doesn't take your 11-year problem away. So sure, if you buy a new one that has all this fancy stuff on it, that's great, but then you've still got the one sitting in the closet for 10 years. That's probably statistically the one that's more likely to be used. Yeah, like some of those gun store owners were getting like death threats and all kinds of stuff, I read. But anyway, so I think the conclusion from this, with basically looking at what's possible in the United States, it's more the very targeted prevention of the firearm getting into the hands of someone other than the intended owner is where they start. And they don't feel hugely promising about things like restrictions on gun sales to at-risk individuals because of the limited sort of immediate impact. And you also have so many firearms already in circulation. Yeah, there's other strategies that they still are trying to do, I guess, in several states, educating gun shop staff about detection of suicide risk in their customers and sort of what things to look for. But same deal with the 11-year thing. There's such a time frame difference. It says less than 10% of the firearms used in suicides are purchased within 2 weeks of the suicide. So you're missing a whole group of folks. That's really it. I mean, those are the big sort of pros, cons, big things. I mean, again, there's a lot more impact to the suicide rate of kids if firearms are restricted from the home, and 11 years between, median time of purchasing a firearm. Potentially, I mean, and this is something that I think is given that everybody would understand, is basically there are states that the suicide by gunshot, what am I trying to say? Firearm suicide rate is much higher than others, and obviously the impact on reducing on firearm safety is much better in those states where you already have a high population. That's really it. Any questions? Sorry, that was longer than I thought.
No, that's all right. That's a lot of information. So thanks for
It was a
summarizing
lot.
that. Yeah,
Yeah.
in a concise way. Um, the only comment is Julie Lynn said that was the most shocking thing that it was purchased 11 years
I
before. I think that was a
know,
surprise
right?
probably to all of us because
Yeah.
I don't know. I guess the way I've been like trained to think about suicide is it's an impulsive act. And so, but that access is really, I mean, a
Well, they
huge
did
part of it.
comment on that about why they target firearms specifically because the lethality of
Hmm.
firearm, and it is like people will start thinking about it, but it's always the gun that's already in the house. It's
It's already
rarely one that
there.
they're
Yeah.
running out to
Makes
buy
sense,
and then
actually.
coming home to do it,
Hmm. Yeah.
and especially
Um,
with the kids. Yeah.
yeah. So this was published in 2016 or 17?
Yeah. 16.
Okay, 16. So I don't know if it would have any impact on our laws or not, but hopefully someone's reading it.
Yeah,
So,
not in
yeah.
Alabama, I don't think.
Yeah.
There's,
Oh,
yeah,
right.
probably
No, I know certain places. So,
not.
all
Yeah.
right. Well, thank you
Okay.
again,
Okay.
and
Thank you
have a good
guys.
night. And thanks everybody
Okay.
for
Okay.
watching and listening. And of course, as always, you can get the CME. The directions are at the top of the post. You can also just send an email to psychiatrynetwork@gmail.com if you want to get added to our mailing list. And yeah, and oh, and of course, the mailing list, I put a pause on it just temporarily. I'm still gonna continue sending emails, but in the meantime, you can get access to the journal club schedule on psychiatrynetwork.com, and I've updated like the schedule for the rest of the year. So if there's changes in the schedule, it'll always be posted there. All right, everybody, and thank you, Jessica,
Okay.
and
Yeah.
have a good night.
Thanks.
All right, take care.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye, guys. Thanks.